We're in the fourth and final week of our series on Ruth. Let me bring you up to date. Naomi was a widow living in the land of Moab. One of her sons had married a Moabite woman named Ruth. When he passed away, the two widows, Naomi and Ruth, returned to Bethlehem, Naomi's hometown. Naomi tried to get Ruth to stay in Moab, but Ruth declared her loyalty to Naomi. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. At this time in her life, Naomi was depressed and bitter. Once her life had been full, with a husband and sons and a happy home. Now her life was empty, and she had lost everything. She said, "The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." They arrived in Bethlehem just as the harvest was beginning. And as we've seen, not only was it a harvest time in the fields, it was harvest time for Ruth and Naomi. They were two desperately poor widows, but Ruth took the initiative to make their situation better. One day she told Naomi, "I'll go to the fields and walk behind the laborers and gather whatever stalks of grain they leave behind so that we'll have something to eat." It just so happened that day, obviously God had planned it, that Ruth went to a field owned by a man named Boaz. Boaz was a righteous man. He was also a relative of Naomi's. When he saw Ruth working in his field, he asked his foreman, "Who is that woman?" Boaz made it a point to give Ruth special treatment. He told his workers, "Don't bother her, let her work. Share your water with her, and when she's behind picking up the leftover stalks of barley, leave a few extra for her." He invited Ruth to have lunch with the crew, and at day's end, he sent her home with a week's worth of food. From the looks of things, Boaz had a bit of a crush on Ruth. Ruth worked in Boaz's field until the harvest came in. It was at this time that Naomi had an idea to secure their future. Boaz was what they called a kinsman redeemer in his family. A kinsman redeemer was a sort of, the historical equivalent of a rich uncle. Each extended family had a few kinsman redeemers, men of character and affluence, who made themselves available to help out family members in times of trouble. I'll admit I'm oversimplifying the description a little bit, because there were specific guidelines for kinsmen redeemers to follow, but that's basically how it worked. Naomi's late husband owned some land in Bethlehem, but apparently he had mortgaged it a decade earlier during a time of famine, shortly before he moved his family to Moab. When Ruth and Naomi came back, the land was still there, but there was a mortgage on it, so she could no longer have rights to it. And this is where Boaz, the kinsman redeemer, fits in. He could redeem the property, that is, buy it back, so that Naomi could live there and use the land to produce an income. He would then be like a joint owner. More specifically, according to the customs of the day, Naomi would become the wife of Boaz. If they had no children, and Naomi may have been past that age, Boaz and his sons would inherit the property when she passed away. But what about Ruth? It could be said that Ruth also had a claim to the property. Her late husband, Naomi's son, would have inherited this land if he had lived. To complicate the custom just a bit, if a kinsman redeemer redeemed a property for a childless widow, he was expected to become her husband and to provide her with a son so that the name of her late husband would live on. This would alter the joint ownership agreement, since the new son would inherit the land. It was in this context that Naomi came up with a plan. She knew that Boaz was a little smitten with Ruth, so Naomi said, "Boaz will be at the threshing floor tonight, so put on your best dress and fix your hair, spray some perfume and pay Boaz a visit. After he's asleep, go to where he is and lay down at his feet." This gesture was not suggestive, it was symbolic. By laying at his feet, Ruth would be telling Boaz that she is available for marriage. Ruth did what Naomi said, and when Boaz woke up in the middle of the night and found Ruth lying at his feet, she said, "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." He knew exactly what she was saying. He knew that she was referring to Naomi's property, and he knew her motive was not merely that she wanted to be his wife, but she wanted to marry a man who could look after her widowed mother-in-law too. For this reason, Boaz admired Ruth all the more. He said, okay, I'm willing to be your kinsman redeemer, and I'm willing to marry you, but there is a catch. What was the catch? Well, the catch was that the kinsman redeemer arrangement followed a process determined by nearest of kin. There was another kinsman redeemer in the family, more closely related to Naomi than Boaz. So Boaz said to Ruth, one way or another, you will be taken care of. I'll talk to him about it. If he doesn't want to redeem the land and take you as his bride, I will do it. He then sent Ruth out on her way. And so today we arrive in chapter 4, the thrilling conclusion. How will this story end? Will the kinsman redeemer buy back the land? Will Boaz marry the woman of his dreams? And what about Naomi? There's a revealing verse in chapter 3. After Boaz told Ruth he would take care of the matter, he gave her some barley to take home with her. And the Bible says, then he went back to town. What does this verse reveal? Well, it's interesting that Boaz went immediately back to town. He was still finishing the harvest, but he stopped what he was doing to go look for the other kinsman redeemer. I think Boaz did this for a couple of reasons. One, he knew that Ruth and Naomi were counting on him and were waiting on him, and he didn't want to leave them hanging on. Two, it's obvious that he had an emotional investment in the outcome, and he was eager to get it resolved. This is further demonstrated by the first verse of chapter 4. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat there. What was he doing? He was waiting for the other kinsman redeemer. When the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned came along, Boaz said, come over here, my friend, and sit down. So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here, and they did so. Then he said to the kinsman redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Amalek. Brother can also be translated relative. Boaz then continued, I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I'm next in line. I will redeem it, he said. I have no doubt that Boaz knew exactly what he was doing. He discussed the redemption with the man in public in the presence of the town leadership, so that the man would be pressed to make an immediate decision. That was only fair to Ruth and Naomi, since they shouldn't be kept waiting for weeks and months while the man decides what to do. At first, Boaz made it seem like a simple transaction. Buy some land, help a family member out. So the man said, sure, why not? I'll do it. Then Boaz let the man know what he was getting into. Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, you acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. That changes everything. Instead of getting some good land at a good price, the man was told that he would be taking on the responsibility of a new family and with a foreign woman. At this, the kinsman redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because it might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. Boaz wasted no time in concluding the transaction publicly. Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilon, and Mahlon. I've also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with this property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Today, you are witnesses. Today, the idea seems strange. You can buy a property and a wife comes with it. Some people criticize these parts of the Bible because it's archaic and in our modern way of thinking, barbaric. However, it shouldn't surprise us when a 3,000-year-old story reflects the 3,000-year-old customs. For those days, it wasn't barbaric at all. In fact, this law reflects a proper concern for the poor. This law was on the books so that widows and their children wouldn't be left homeless and helpless when the husband passed away. Then the elders and all those at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephraim and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." So Boaz takes Ruth and she becomes his wife. And he went to her and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Isn't it wonderful? Ruth and Boaz married, they started a family, and they built a life together. I love happy endings, don't you? The name of the book is Ruth. But really, this is Naomi's story. Do you remember where we began 4 weeks ago? We began with the death of Naomi's sons. Today, the story ends with the marriage of her daughter-in-law and the birth of a baby boy. In chapter 1, Naomi thought that her life was finished. In chapter 4, she sees that it's just beginning. In chapter 1, you find Naomi full of doubt and bitterness and self-pity. In chapter 4, you find her overflowing with joy. Friends, this is the God we serve. He can take a life that is empty and afflicted and barren and fill it with joy and purpose and new birth. I often talk to people who are living in a place like the place Naomi lived in chapter 1 of this story, in a land like the land of Moab, far from the experience of God's blessings, experienced instead one setback after another. Like Naomi, these people feel like their best days are behind them. Once their lives were full, but now they're forever empty. Well, I want you to know that no life is forever empty as far as God is concerned. He can redeem any life from any situation. Maybe you think of yourself only as a person with a past, but God sees you as someone with a future. And as we bring this series to a close, there are 3 final lessons I want us to reflect on. These lessons remind you that in God, you have a future. First of all, I'd like you to remember that you are not without after all. After Ruth had her son, the women came together and said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout all Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age." He's not left you without a redeemer. They're referring, on the one hand, to Boaz, whose generosity has saved the family's land and has kept alive the family name. They're also referring to this baby boy. They're calling him a kinsman redeemer because this little boy represents the completion of God's redemption in Naomi's life. Maybe you think your life right now is about being without. You're without the health you need, or the money you need, or the job you need, or the spouse you need, or the blessings you need. Everything in your life spells without. Well, I want you to know that God will not leave you without forever. The emptiness of the land of Moab and Ruth chapter 1 will be replaced in your life by the fullness of Bethlehem and Ruth chapter 4. Naomi couldn't see these blessings coming, but they came because God would not leave her in a state of without. Here's the second lesson I want us to reflect on. What you think is a burden can turn into a blessing. The women said, "For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth." Better than 7 sons, and they were right. Ruth was better than 7 sons, but Naomi didn't see it that way on the first page of this story. Do you remember what she said when she tried to get her daughters-in-law to turn back and stay in Moab? She said, "Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." Naomi saw her daughters-in-law as a burden. She could only think of the financial obligation she would face with them and how she wouldn't be able to provide. So she encouraged the young women to return to Moab and find husbands there. As you remember, one daughter-in-law over did go back to Moab. Ruth decided to stay. And what happened? Ruth certainly wasn't a burden to Naomi. She was a blessing. There are some things in your life today that you see as burdens. Well, take another look at them. God can make them into a blessing. Here's the third lesson I want you to remember. There's a big picture, and you're in it. Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. When her sons died, Naomi probably thought she would never have a chance to hold a baby in her arms again. But she did. And it wasn't just any baby. The Bible says, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Father of David? King David? The one who killed Goliath? The one who wrote, "The Lord's my shepherd, I shall not want"? That David. Naomi played a big part in the birth of a king. Still, that's not all. Generations later, a young woman in the line of David, a young woman named Mary, gave birth to her son Jesus. It was God's plan that a Moabite woman be part of a royal bloodline, an ancestor to Jesus the Messiah. Naomi played a part in making it happen. She persuaded Ruth to go to the threshing floor at midnight so that the wedding could take place, so that a baby could be born that would lead the way to birth of God's son. God has a plan, not only for your life, but for the lives of all those around you, your children and their spouses, and your grandchildren and their future spouses, and all of their children too. God has a plan for them, and you have a part to play. You may not be able to see it. You may not fully understand it. You may not be able to anticipate it, but God has a plan. There's a big picture. And when you live in submission to him, he's able to get you in the picture. That's why I say you have a future. The story of Ruth is a story of redemption. It shows us how, through God, the lives of two seemingly insignificant widowed women can go from tragedy to triumph and from bitterness to blessing. You would think these women's lives would be lived in obscurity, and yet God made their names great throughout history. That's the power of God's redemption. And as we close this series, I want to remind you that Naomi experienced the events of chapter 4 because of the decision she made in chapter 1. When she was at her lowest, she got on the road that would take her back to Bethlehem, that road that would take her back home. And you can experience God's redemptive power too. He can turn your life around, and he will. He's waiting for you to take the first steps in his direction on the road that leads you to where you know you need to be. Amen. And now we sing, Christ is mine forever.